Hello, U.S. history students. The purpose of this lecture, as you can see below, we are going to look into the idea of the topic of World War II. And in brief, what we want to do is trace the developments of the 1930s that led to the outbreak of the Second World War, reflect on why war was the preferred choice of Germany, Italy, and Japan, and then briefly, if time remains, talk about the United States' position vis-a-vis this war and what was going on in Europe in general. So that being said, we will move right along. So first we're going to look at the starting point. And the starting point really kind of goes back to the Depression and the great stock market crash of 1929, when some would argue the Depression really began. At any rate, the onset of Depression destroyed the peace foundations that the United States had worked very hard to build in the 1920s. Now, how had the United States tried to build peace in the world? If you remember, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points at the end of World War I at the Paris Peace Treaty conference had largely failed, and Wilson came back to the United States after having gone to negotiate in person with the Treaty of Versailles in particular, and the League of Nations. And if you don't remember, the League of Nations was something that was supposed to preserve or secure peace and preserve peace among the nations of the world. The United States Senate decided that it did not like the treaty for various reasons and rejected the treaty. So the United States is not part of the League of Nations, the world body, again, designed to secure peace among the nations of the world. So you might be asking, well, how is it then that the United States worked to promote peace in the world? And I think you can see here listed several points. I think there are 3 points mainly, and the U.S. really did work in earnest and seriously by sponsoring a naval arms reduction conference in 1921, 1922 in Washington that led to the Washington Naval Treaty, an agreement between the major powers of the world, the United States, France, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, to limit the sizes of their respective navies. And they would have another conference in 1930 in London to re-up that Washington Naval Treaty. The other way that the United States tried to promote peace was through massive bank loans, both in 1924, led by Charles Dawes, and in 1929, led by a banker named Young, by which the United States loaned large sums of money to Germany so that Germany could repay Britain and France for the damages and losses suffered during World War I. So those are what we call reparations payments. And so the United States was actively trying to restore the world economy by getting a flow of money. And Britain and France, by the way, had borrowed large sums of money from the United States. So when Germany pays Britain and France back, Britain and France pay the United States back, and then the idea was that trade and money would go back to Germany. This was supposed to promote economic activity and financial activity, and then that would promote peace. The last thing you see on the screen is something known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg was the United States Secretary of State, and Briand was the French Foreign Minister. And in 1928, they met and worked out a treaty that many other nations subsequently signed that basically said the advanced nations of the world give up the idea of war. They renounce, that is, war as a means to achieve their nation's end. So it seemed like things were going along pretty well, despite the idea that many have that the United States was somehow isolated, that the United States didn't really take an interest in world affairs and didn't really care that much. I think that's not true, and I think that things were going really well until we have the 1929 stock market crash, and then the onset of the Great Depression. And that's really what's going to disrupt and ultimately destroy the United States' efforts to achieve and promote peace across the world. And when we see that happen, what's going to then ensue in this next slide is what many would call the death of democracy in the 1930s. And this was a worldwide phenomenon. So this is not just something that's located in Europe, but we're going to see that it spreads all the way to Southeast Asia. And I think that again, the real piece here, the big connection here is the idea of depression and misery. So people losing jobs, people losing their homes, people without food, people without clothes, people forced to live on streets and beg, both in the United States and in European nations, is going to lead to the rise of these dictators. Sorry about that, brief phone interruption. Getting back to the point, the death of democracy. What we see with the onset of depression and the misery that it caused is the rise of a new class of political leader, and I'm going to call them totalitarian dictators. These dictators promise to restore good times and even greatness to their respective nations. And their words, the way that they spoke, the emotions generated in their speaking to people really captured the attention. It captured, I would even say, the imagination of people who, again, you have to remember, I think, that were in a bad place. They didn't have jobs. Or if they did, there was a lot of economic insecurity and fear that they might lose jobs. They're concerned about being able to provide basic necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter. So the voices of these dictators, and you see here pictured Adolf Hitler in a very classic pose as he reviews a line of soldiers marching past him in front of his car, really resounded, and these leaders became popular. So let's just look at them and very quickly. Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Tojo in Japan, Franco in Spain, Horthy in Hungary. So I guess the simple question is, what is the trend? And you should stop the lecture and write down the trend. Why do you think the peoples of these nations that you see listed here really flocked to these leaders, these charismatic leaders that offered this new vision of hope and prosperity and promise for the future? So that's one thing that we should really think about, or that you should really think about. All right, so moving onward. So when did World War II start? And where did World War II start? So contrary to popular myth, again, I think we can look at World War II actually beginning, according to some historians, in China in 1931 and 1932. So World War II begins in Southeast Asia, not Europe. And it begins with the Japanese assault on a region of northeastern China that you see listed in this map, or you see outlined in this map, called Manchuria. And the Japanese made a flimsy excuse that the Chinese had attacked a Japanese railway that had run through Manchuria, and therefore that the Japanese had to defend their railway and the workers that were killed by invading all of Manchuria. The attack really was made up. It was actually Japanese army personnel that staged the attack on the Japanese railway itself. Historians later found out, of course, looking at documents. But nonetheless, the Japanese used this as an excuse to invade Manchuria. So Japan fabricates an alleged attack. And that's an interesting thing, the idea of fabricating an attack to then pursue a full-scale war. And we're going to see this in the 20th century. And it's something that, by the way, the United States is going to engage in, at least United States leaders and presidents in particular, when we think about the war with Spain in 1898, largely fabricated. When we think about World War II itself, there are going to be incidents that were alleged or fabricated, or at least played up to promote the idea of war. Vietnam, and lastly, the Iraq War of 2003 to 2011. So this idea of fabricating attacks on one's nation to then justify a response is an interesting, I think, lesson that we see and that we should take away. So we should pay attention to these things. So in the aftermath of this attack, the United States Secretary of State, a man named Stimson, vigorously denounced the attacks as unjustified aggression that the United States could not and would not tolerate. And what really is at play here, and I'll move to the next slide, is these attacks by Japan on China violated the idea of the open door policy that the United States had really put in place from the late 1890s, and President Hoover reaffirmed the open door. President Roosevelt is going to reaffirm the open door and talk about the good neighbor policy. So the United States again believes that open doors promote trade, promote the flow of money and people that leads to peace. And when Japan attacks China as it did, it slammed the door shut, and you see that pictured, I think, in this political cartoon here. So again, the idea of free trade equaling the free flow of investments and peace and prosperity was greatly disrupted by Japanese aggression in China. Now, you might ask, well, what was China doing this for? Well, China, or why was Japan doing this to China, rather? Well, Japan is a tiny island nation that had embarked on a very rapid campaign of developing its industrial base and its military might. And it needed resources. It needed energy resources. It needed raw materials to produce steel that would be then turned into ships and later airplanes. So Manchuria is a region that held a lot of promise for these natural resources. Therefore, Japan is going to, it moved against it very aggressively. Now, the interesting thing is, what was the response of the world community? Well, the world community and the League of Nations condemned the attacks by the Japanese. However, the Japanese didn't really take them very seriously. That is, the Japanese kind of blew off the League of Nations. And in fact, Japan withdraws from the League of Nations in 1932 and walks out. Several years later, that is 1937, we see that a full-scale war broke out between Japan and China. And here is one of the pictures, I think one of the stark and really brutal pictures of that 1937 war. The Japanese used airplanes to bombard Chinese cities, and we see for the first time the brutality and the inhumanity that is rained down from the skies, and we see indiscriminate death and destruction of property. And here you can see this lone baby that had survived an aerial bombardment by the Japanese in obviously a state of pain, shock, and anguish, with nobody there to help him. And I think this really sort of encapsulates and epitomizes what would become war in the 20th century, the ever-increasing use of airplanes dropping bombs on industrial targets, but of course bombs are never 100% accurate. So at this point, the Japanese rapidly defeat the Chinese government led by Chiang Kai-shek, whom you might remember from last year's course, retreat and form an uneasy alliance with the communists to deal with the Japanese presence in their mainland. So from that part of the world, we're now going to move back to Europe, which is probably more familiar to most of you. So we're going to look at Germany in the 1930s. And in 1933, due in large part to the suffering and uncertainty caused by the Depression, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Chancellor is the leader of the German government. And chancellors are appointed by the German president. So the president appoints a chancellor. The chancellor is the person who really does the governing day to day. The president is more of a figurehead. And here in this picture, you see the president, Paul von Hindenburg, a World War I general, I would say hero of sorts, though Germany lost the war, making Adolf Hitler the chancellor. And this occurred in 1933. And Hitler, as chancellor, very quickly invented a series of stories of alleged communist takeovers of the German government, claiming that the German parliamentary building known as the Reichstag was burned down in a fire set by communist arsonists. And Hitler used this fire as a means to creating a one-man dictatorship over all of Germany by 1934. So less than a year in office as chancellor, Hitler has made himself the undisputed leader of the German people, and his Nazi party was the only party allowed to function in Germany. So, and Hitler then, seeing what the Japanese had done after their attacks on Manchuria, also decides that it's time for Germany to quit the League of Nations, which he does. and then he embarks on a rapid military buildup to create a large scale army. So with that, we'll stop here, the end of lecture 1. Thank you.